All right, so you're here with us on the deep dive because, well, let's be honest. You want to get right to the heart of things, right? You want that core knowledge. You don't have time to wade through all that extra stuff, and that's what we do here.
That's right. We do all that waiting for you.
That's right. So today, we're going to be looking at something that gets a lot of people, kind of excited, the EB-5 investor visa.
Yeah.
Could this be a genuine, fast track to getting a U.S. green card?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is the question a lot of people have, when you think about all the, the maze of, ways to get permanent residency in the U.S., the traditional routes.
Right.
This seems like a very straightforward one if you can afford it.
Exactly right. Forget the years of waiting for an employer to sponsor you or trying to figure out the complexities of family-based applications.
Right.
This is just, hey, you invest, you get a green card.
Right.
So that's very compelling.
Yeah.
So we got to ask, how does this, this investment for residency thing actually work? What's the real story with the EB-5 visa?
Well, at its heart, it is designed to attract foreign investment to the United States economy. And by doing that, to fuel job creation.
Okay.
So it's a trade. You're investing in the U.S. economy, and in exchange, you get the opportunity to live and work here permanently.
Okay, so that sounds, that's definitely a win-win, on paper,
Oh, right.
You bypass all these other, immigration log jams because you're contributing. You're making a significant financial contribution.
Right.
But what is a significant financial contribution? What are we talking about here?
Well, there are two levels that you need to know about.
Okay.
The first one is the standard investment level, which is currently $1,050,000.
Okay.
But that drops to $800,000
Okay.
if you invest in what's called a targeted employment area, or TEA.
Okay, so a TE,
Right.
that sounds like a very specific type of location.
Right.
What makes somewhere a TEA and why the lower investment amount for those?
It's essentially an area that the government has decided needs help with economic revitalization.
Okay.
And typically that is defined as either a rural area
Okay.
or an area that has high unemployment.
Okay.
Specifically, an area where the unemployment rate is at least 1.5 times the national average.
Okay.
So the reason for the lower investment level is to incentivize people to put their money into those areas.
Okay. That makes sense, to try to stimulate growth where it's needed the most.
Right.
So we're talking, $800,000 to over $1 million.
Right.
That money isn't just sitting in an account somewhere that has to actively create jobs, right?
Right.
You mentioned earlier at least 10 full-time jobs.
Right.
That sounds pretty significant.
It is. It's a cornerstone of the program for every investment that's made under EB-5 regulations. Say that you have to create at least 10 full-time positions for qualified U.S. workers.
Okay.
Now, important to note, you, the investor, and your family don't count toward that 10.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. Okay. So 10 jobs that could be, I'm thinking you'd have to start a whole company.
Right.
Is that always the case, or are there other ways to fulfill that requirement?
There are.
Okay.
Yeah. So we were talking earlier about direct and indirect jobs.
Yeah.
So we need to talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. So let's unpack that a bit more.
So basically, a direct job is a job where you're hiring the employee directly into the new commercial enterprise that you have created with your EB-5 investment.
Okay.
An indirect job is one that's created as a result of the investment,
Okay.
but it exists in a separate entity.
Okay.
So think of it this way. If you were investing in, say, a factory, the workers on the factory floor would be direct hires.
Okay.
But that factory is going to be demanding raw materials from suppliers in the area.
Right.
So the increase in demand for those raw materials is going to result in indirect jobs at the supplier companies.
Oh.
That's where regional centers come in.
Okay. So yeah, we've touched on regional centers a little bit. These are pre-approved entities that pool investments together.
Right. How do they simplify the job creation aspect for an investor?
So a regional center is a government-approved entity.
Okay.
And they're often focused on a particular geographic region and a particular set of industries.
Oh, okay.
And what they do is they sponsor EB-5 investment projects. And these projects could be anything. They could be large real estate developments.
Oh, okay.
They could be infrastructure projects, all kinds of different things. But the point is that they've already been vetted by USCIS.
Okay.
So for an investor, they're going to put their capital into a regional center project.
Okay.
Often they can satisfy the job creation requirement by relying on the project's own predicted job creation numbers,
Okay.
including those indirect jobs that we just talked about.
Okay.
So this can be much more hands-off
Right.
than if you were going to start a new business and directly hire those 10 people yourself. It's interesting, too, that it's not just, these regional centers. They're not just focused on, say, one tiny little company. They're often focused on these larger scale projects that would have like a ripple effect on the local economy.
Right. They could have a huge impact on local economies.
Right. But that also means that they're susceptible to,
Absolutely.
the market forces, right?
Sure. Any large project is going to be at the mercy of market conditions.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like I have a choice. I can either launch my own business, directly hire at least 10 people,
Right.
or I can go with a regional center project where that job creation is already kind of, projected and managed at a larger scale.
Right. And, the regional center route is often viewed as a more passive route for the investor because they're not involved in the day-to-day operations of the company.
Right.
And they can rely on these economic models to show the job creation.
Yeah.
But I want to be careful to say the due diligence on the regional center and the particular project is extremely important. Not all regional centers are created equal.
Right. Of course.
And so it's really important to look at their track record and look at the projects and make sure that they make sense.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say someone, they've got the money, they're willing to make that significant investment. They understand the job creation piece, whether it's direct or through a regional center.
Right.
What does the actual process of applying for an EB-5 visa look like? What are the steps involved?
So the application process is generally broken down into 4 main stages. The first is submitting Form I-526E, which is formally called the Immigrant Petition by Alien Investor.
Okay.
And this is basically where you, the investor, are going to establish that you meet all the eligibility criteria for the program.
Okay.
You have the funds available.
Okay.
The investment that you're planning makes sense. It aligns with the program rules, et cetera, et cetera.
So you're showing them, hey, I'm serious. I've got the capital and
Right.
I've got a legit, investment plan.
Exactly. And alongside the I-526E, you're also going to have to submit a lot of documentation that proves that the funds that you're using to make this investment were obtained legally.
Okay.
This is really important. USCIS scrutinizes the source of funds very carefully.
Of course.
So step 1, prove you're eligible and prove that your money's clean.
Gotcha. Okay. So step 1 is done.
Right.
What happens in step 2?
Step 2 is actually deploying the capital.
Okay.
So you're actually going to make the investment. The funds have to be irrevocably committed to either the new commercial enterprise or to the regional center project.
Okay.
Okay, so once the I-526E is approved, you've made your investment, then the next steps depend on whether you're already in the United States or whether you're applying from overseas.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So different pathways depending on where you're physically located.
Right, so if you are already in the U.S. on a valid non-immigrant visa,
Okay.
you would file Form I-485 application to register permanent residence or
Sure.
adjust status. And that allows you to adjust your status from within the U.S. to conditional permanent resident.
Okay.
If you're applying from outside the U.S., then you have to go through consular processing
Okay.
through the Department of State.
Okay.
And that involves filing an immigrant visa application using Form DS-260 at a U.S. embassy or consulate in your home country.
Okay. So adjust from within the U.S. or go through the embassy process if you're overseas.
Right.
Okay. And then you get your green card and you're all set.
Right. Not quite. So you're going to get what's called a conditional green card.
Right.
And this is valid for a 2-year period.
Okay.
And within 90 days before the expiration of that 2-year conditional residency, you have to file another Form I-829 petition by investor to remove conditions
Okay.
on permanent resident status.
Oh, okay.
And this is where you're really going to have to prove to USCIS that you actually did what you said you were going to do in terms of job creation.
Right. Okay.
So if that petition is approved, then the conditions are removed from your green card and you become a lawful permanent resident of the U.S.
So a 2-year probationary period to make
Yeah.
sure that you're actually creating those jobs.
Right.
Okay, cool. So, we know with immigration there can be a lot of wait times. What kind of time frame are we talking about for the whole EB-5 process?
Well, it can vary quite a bit. There are a lot of factors that influence it. Your country of origin has a lot to do with it because there are annual per country visa quotas.
Right.
And then it depends on the workload of USCIS and backlogs and things like that.
Right.
But historically, the I-526E petition, that initial petition, the processing times, could be anywhere from a year to several years.
Wow.
And then you've got to add on the time for adjustment of status or for consular processing, and then the 2 years of conditional residency.
Right.
So realistically, you're probably looking at somewhere between 2 and 5 years
Okay.
to go from initial filing all the way to actually getting your permanent green card.
Okay.
And it could be longer than that. You got to be prepared for a long haul.
Yeah. Okay. So it might be a different route,
Right.
but it's not necessarily a fast route.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's talk about some of the, clear advantages and maybe some of the drawbacks to the EB-5 visa.
Sure.
What are the main upsides?
Okay, so one big advantage is that you don't need an employer to sponsor you,
Oh, okay.
and you don't need to have family ties to U.S. citizens or permanent residents.
Right.
So it opens up an avenue for immigration to people who may not qualify through those traditional pathways.
Okay.
Second advantage is that the green card that you get through EB-5 covers not only the investor, but also their spouse and any unmarried children under the age of 21.
Okay.
So the whole immediate family can immigrate together.
So that's a huge bonus right there if you've got a family and you're looking to relocate.
Right.
What about the investment itself?
Yeah.
You talked about how, going the regional center route could be more of a passive role.
Right.
Is that a big advantage for investors?
Absolutely. The people who are using the regional center route, they typically don't need to be involved in the day-to-day operations of the business.
Okay.
Their investment is pooled with other people's investment in a larger project.
Okay.
And the responsibility for actually running the business and demonstrating the job creation
Right.
Often rests with the regional center operators.
Okay.
So it can be really appealing to people who don't necessarily want to,
Right.
run a business.
Or have the expertise to run a business.
Right, exactly. But they have the capital to invest.
Right.
So
Mhm.
yeah, it's a hands-off way to achieve permanent residency, potentially.
Okay. So those are some compelling benefits, a more direct route, no need for traditional sponsorships, the potential for a passive investment.
Right.
But what about the challenges? What are some of the potential pitfalls someone considering EB-5 needs to be aware of?
Well, I think the most significant hurdle for most people is the sheer amount of money involved.
Yeah.
We're talking at least $800,000.
Yeah.
Potentially over $1 million. That's an enormous financial decision, and that alone puts this option out of reach for most people.
Right.
But even beyond that, you have to remember this is an investment.
Right.
Like any investment, it carries risk.
Right.
There's no guarantee that the new commercial enterprise or the regional center project is going to succeed.
Right.
So if the project doesn't work out, you could lose a big chunk or even all of your invested capital.
So you're saying there's a real possibility that someone could, invest all this money,
Right.
not get the green card and lose all their money.
A real possibility.
That sounds like a very high stakes gamble.
It is. And, it's important to remember that when you get approval of your I-526E,
Yeah.
all that means is that your investment plan meets the basic requirements. It doesn't guarantee that the business is going to succeed.
Right.
And ultimately, the removal of the conditions on your green card is going to depend on proving that you actually created the 10 jobs.
Right.
So the business fails. You don't meet that job creation threshold. Then your application for a green card could be denied.
Wow.
And we talked about the processing times.
Yeah.
Your money's going to be tied up for quite a while, and there's no guarantee of a return on that investment or a green card at the end.
Okay. So, yeah, not a guaranteed fast track.
Yeah.
And you really got to understand the risks involved.
Absolutely.
Okay. So it's a high stakes thing with a huge financial commitment.
Right.
And some very real downsides.
Yeah.
Not something to enter into lightly.
Absolutely not. Due diligence is paramount.
Yeah.
You have to thoroughly vet the project that you're considering, the people or entities who are going to be managing it.
Right.
The regional center, if you're going that route,
Yeah.
you need to do a lot of research.
Right.
Get expert advice.
Right.
It's super important.
Okay. So we've talked about, what the EB-5 visa is. We've looked at the financial requirements, the job creation requirements, the application process,
Yeah.
Pros and cons. How would you sum up this particular pathway to U.S. permanent residency?
Well, it's a potential route to a green card
Okay.
for foreign nationals who have the money
Okay.
and who are willing to make a big investment in the U.S. economy.
Okay.
And by doing that, to create jobs for American workers,
Okay.
it is an alternative to the more
Yeah.
traditional routes.
Okay.
But it has its own requirements
Right.
and it has risks.
Right. Okay. So for anyone listening who's thinking, okay, this might be something I want to look into, what are the must-remember takeaways?
I would say the biggest ones are the amount of money involved,
Right.
the risks that are inherent in any business investment,
Yeah.
And the fact that this is a process that's going to take several years,
Okay.
it's a long process,
Right.
and there's no guaranteed outcome.
Right.
You have to meet that initial investment threshold. You
Yeah,
have
yeah.
to file the petition. That's just the beginning.
Yeah.
Ultimately, your success in getting that green card is going to depend on whether you can prove that you actually created the jobs through that investment.
No. Right. Okay. So if someone's thinking, yeah, this is something I want to look into more, what should their next step be?
The most important next step is to consult with an experienced immigration attorney,
Okay.
someone who specializes in EB-5 cases.
Okay.
They can give you advice that's specific to your situation.
Okay.
They can help you with the legal requirements of the program.
Okay.
They can help you evaluate the risks and the potential rewards.
Okay.
This is not a place to, try to do it yourself.
Right.
You really need professional help.
Absolutely. So it sounds like navigating this process really requires, an expert guide.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about, the financial requirements, job creation requirements, the
Right.
timeline, the risk, all these things.
Right.
What are some key factors someone should really consider when trying to decide, is the EB-5 visa even an option for me?
Right.
What's the big question they need to ask themselves before jumping in?
I think the big question is, given the huge amount of money involved
Right.
and the real possibility that you could lose that money,
Yeah.
given that the process is going to take a long time and you may not succeed at the end of it,
Right.
is getting a green card and the opportunities that offers
Right.
worth it to you?
Yeah.
It's not just, can you invest? It's, is the potential reward
Yeah.
worth the risk and the commitment?
Exactly.
The commitment of your time and your capital.
It's a big question, and you got to think it through carefully.
Absolutely.
All right, well, I think that is a fantastic place to leave it. So,
Yeah.
thanks for diving in with us today,
My pleasure.
and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Okay.